Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Todd Latham. I'm the President, Chief Bottle Washer at Actual Media, the host of today's Excess Soil Symposium. I'm really pleased to see over 280 people as part of this. Some great sessions so far. This is our final session of the day on best practices driving successful implementation of standards in excess soils management. I'm going to keep my opening remarks very brief so that I can have the speakers do a lot of that talking. There are no soils jokes from me. I think Emma's got the best soils jokes, so you can call on her for those. But just to outline, I think Andy mentioned at the opening how excess soils has been a conversation we've been having in Canada and in Ontario for about 20 years. And we were talking earlier in our practice session about the CLARE model in the UK and how that's been moved over to Canada. And now we're adopting that through regulations, through standards, through technology, through web apps and software tools that you'll hear from later. So, and then Megan, earlier this morning, 350 trucks a day were moving on to the Portland site from those soil host sites, or moving on to the Portland site from those two construction sites. But without further ado, I'm going to open it up to introductions. We'll start first with Krista.
Thanks, Todd. My name is Krista Barfoot, and I am a principal with Stantec in the Environmental Services Group. I am also a member of ONEA and CBN's Excess Soil subcommittees, and I have been participating in the Excess Soil Symposium since 2017, and I'm a member of the ministry's Excess Soil Engagement Group. I was asked to talk today in terms of best practices about how people are using strategic site planning to get good alignment with regulation. And there's kind of three key things I want to touch on here in terms of what we've seen in the last year for people aligning themselves with the regulation through strategic planning. And the one thing we've seen a lot of focus on is reuse sites. And so I think people have broadly recognized in the industry there is this challenge associated with identifying appropriate reuse sites that will accept the right quality of soil and be open and receiving soil in alignment with a project schedule. And so what we have first off seen in the industry is very much a focus on reducing as much as possible the amount of excess soil that's generated from a site. So reusing as much as possible within a project area. But obviously that's not practical for a lot of projects. They will be generating excess soil. And so to help manage some of the risks associated with identifying reuse sites, we are seeing, and I'd say more strongly in the development community, really that looking across different development sites for opportunities to reuse soil across development sites that are under the care and control of a single project leader. That does seem to be something that is more able to be achieved within the development community. It's a little bit harder, I think, for government agencies to do that. And so what we're seeing from the government side is more of this proactively going out and looking for reuse sites and establishing contracts with reuse sites in advance of construction tendering. So really trying to get some better closure and certainty around reuse sites is one thing we're definitely seeing. Something else we're seeing is really this focus on winding the obligations of the regulation into the whole project delivery framework in a way that's very cost effective and schedule effective. And usually the focus there is on the engagement of the qualified person in terms of when they're engaged and how they're engaged within that project delivery framework. The regulation does require that some of the obligations of the regulation do use a qualified person. And so there is sort of a need to focus on how that party gets engaged and when and where they're engaged within the delivery framework. So there is a lot of focus on the evaluation and the vetting of that qualified person, given they are really there to protect the liability of the project leader. We're seeing a lot of focus on the benefits that can be achieved by engaging that qualified person earlier in the process in terms of understanding soil quality and being able to do appropriate planning in terms of identifying reuse sites and so on. But there's always cases where it does make sense perhaps for that qualified person to not be engaged by the project leader, but instead to be engaged later by a contractor. And so in those cases, recognizing that that work does need to be done before soil is shipped off site, there is a need to build those considerations into the schedule for the work so there's time for that work to be completed between award and construction. And then the last kind of thing that we're seeing is in terms of contracting, and Janet touched on this earlier, there's been a lot of focus on making sure the regulatory requirements are weaved into the contracting process. So there's very clear definition of roles and responsibilities. So we've seen a lot of focus in the past year on coming up with special provisions that really detail the obligations and specifically assign them to certain parties. So that's the other thing we're really seeing in terms of site strategy. That's it for me, Todd.
Thanks, Krista. And now we'll let Warren introduce himself.
Thanks, Todd. Hi, everybody. I'm Warren Croft. I'm a principal and a QP with GHD. I've got more than 20 years of experience in site assessment and brownfield redevelopment. And I've developed and implemented soil management plans for a variety of projects, brownfields, infrastructure projects, tunneling projects, and large development sites that have multiple regulators involved. And I've been asked to comment on a few of the things that we're seeing in terms of innovations or changes in the technical aspects of drilling and sampling work. And I'd love to say that there's a perfect uniform approach, but we are seeing a very broad spectrum in approaches. We've got project owners who've integrated excess soil management into their projects really well. Krista and a few others have mentioned that idea of planning ahead and maybe building it into your project early. And we've seen that in some cases, but we are still seeing contractors and property owners who have been fairly reactive, had limited exposure to the new regulation, and are really continuing with their status quo approach. And that would be, collecting as few samples as you can, maybe commenting on a specific pile or a specific area one at a time, and not really addressing the intent of the regulation. So I think there's still some work to do there. We are seeing more situations where as an owner is purchasing a property or starting their due diligence, that they're looking at excess soil management as part of the purchase due diligence or during their geotechnical investigation to support design. There's big cost savings there. There's also risk mitigation. As you get into a project, your first opportunity to identify a concern is during that due diligence. And if you consider excess soil at that time, you have a potential to mitigate your risk. And I just wanted to share one other thing that came up just a couple of weeks ago. I was on a client call with a fairly large and sophisticated client, and we were talking about soil management for an upcoming project. And we asked the question of who was going to be the project leader. And it sort of bounced around a little bit. And ultimately the discussion came down to the two individuals on the phone. We said one of you is going to be the project leader. And it became real for them at that point that they would actually be the individual who needs to really take responsibility for this. And I think there's probably a lot of people in this session in a similar position. I'll pass it back to you, Todd. Thanks.
Thanks, Warren. Emma, please introduce yourself.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Todd. Appreciate it. So my name is Emma. I'm really excited to be here and have been listening to a lot of great conversations today around excess soil. I think one of the main takeaways that we've all heard today is that finding a receiving site for excess soil is more critical now than ever. So I'm super excited to be here with DirtMarket. We're Canada's excess soil exchange. Currently, finding a receiving site for soil, again, like we've heard today, can be really time consuming, really inefficient. We have construction teams manually calling their contacts. They often have to settle for dump sites in rural areas, pay hefty tipping fees, and like somebody mentioned in the last seminar, get creative with where their soil is going. So with digital solutions like DirtMarket, construction teams can instantly browse nearby receiving sites from their mobile phone or desktop. Digital solutions allow members to post their project area, and we can automatically connect them with a nearby receiving site based on proximity, that soil type, the quantity of soil, and the urgency of the project. So providing digital access to soil reuse opportunities allows for cost savings and supports regulatory compliance, which we've heard a lot about today. So digital solutions can also allow these teams to save records more easily, accurately track their soil, which I'm sure Kevin's going to talk about, share necessary documentation, and more. So one of the largest takeaways, again, from today and the other seminars we've been attending is that pre-planning where your excess soil going is so crucial in the project planning sort of pipeline. So we allow teams to post a project before it even begins so that they can plan where that excess soil movement and disposal is going to be happening before it gets to the point where anyone is scrambling to find a spot to put their excess soil. Having all of your options laid out in front of you makes pre-planning and that later execution significantly easier, which is exactly what DirtMarket strives for, And what we've really seen the industry looking for is an easier solution to finding these sought after receiving sites. So another goal we have, and something I'm hoping to talk a little bit about today, is promoting a circular soil economy by digitally offering reuse opportunities for all the construction teams on our platform. So really excited for today, and we're here to support everyone in the soil moving process and are really another tool in the toolbox when it comes to the digital options available for earth moving. So I'm really looking forward to it today, and looking forward to answering some questions as they come up.
Thanks, Emma. We'll hold your jokes till the end, and because I'm really curious what the best soils jokes are these days. Last but not least, over to you, Kevin, to introduce yourself and set the stage.
Thanks so much, Todd. My name is Kevin Goldberg. I'm the president and co-founder of SoilFlow. SoilFlow is really proud to be a gold sponsor once again for the Excess Soil Symposium. I think the second year digital. Hopefully next year we can meet in person, though it is nice to have everyone from across Canada here. SoilFlow is the leading software used across Ontario, from small sewer and water main jobs to major subway infrastructure projects. What I'm here to talk about today is sophisticated tracking systems, as well as best practices for excavation and soil movement. I've been focused on soil reuse and tracking for the better part of 5 years now. I've done jurisdictional scans across the world and become an expert in workflows of soil movement, from compliance all the way through to billing. Soil tracking and modern technologies is not just about compliance, but everything else we have to grab, from the processes involved. We work across Canada with the core of our business in Ontario, but we're also working on the TMX pipeline expansion. We've had jobs in Nova Scotia, and now we're actually just making our entrance into Australia as well. And to that end, Canada is not unique, and especially neither is Ontario. Any major urban center undergoing a population boom is facing our same challenges. This includes updated code of practices in the UK, as well as new regulations in Australia, and especially the Northeastern United States. What Ontario is now, though, is the gold standard of soil regulations, and I'm excited to see where that's going to take us. In the early implementation of tracking systems on any project, you will be collecting your baseline of information and more information at your fingertips than you've ever had before. From there, you will be able to implement new strategies and be able to measure against your baseline. Standardizing your data collection is about bringing your operations into the modern era and being able to realize continuous improvements over years of your projects. This is what those who digitally track soil are benefiting from today, and this is what I hope I can communicate to you today. Thanks, Todd.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, great. So that is our panelist for today. Just looking at the polls, we do have some results from the polls, and that actually leads into our first question, which is, are we seeing a greater focus on strategic planning and design that minimizes the amount of soil that is disturbed on a site? And the poll shows that 28% of people think that better advanced strategic planning is one of the best practices of technology assisting with excess soil management. So maybe over to you, Krista, and then maybe the rest of the panel on, are we seeing a greater focus on strategic planning?
Yeah, I would say definitely. And like I said, so for the three things that I listed off in terms of proactively looking for reuse options, decreasing the amount of excess soil generated, as well as building a project delivery framework that kind of supports solid planning and then contracting strategies. There's other little nuances that people are starting to touch. And it's been interesting over the last year. It's been very focused on what does the reg mean and how do we implement it? And we're starting to see moving beyond that to how do we be innovative in our application and of the regulation way that helps us be cost effective and schedule effective. And so we're seeing now questions come up about variances. How do we request and get variances for our projects if we need some room for different soil storage requirements? I think it was Frieza who mentioned earlier about processing. We do a lot of road construction in Ontario, it seems. We have a lot of granular removing that falls into this regulation that wouldn't if we did size-based sorting. So how can we use some of these processes to better deliver our projects in a way that's cost effective and remove some of that excess soil we might otherwise generate? So yeah, I'd say for sure we're seeing that, Todd.
Anybody else want to dive in on strategic planning and design as a best practice?
Yeah, I think we're seeing it a lot more on large infrastructure projects where there's a key focus early on to not get surprised by soil quality halfway through the job. And I think there's been a couple of jobs that have been heavily delayed and people have been burned. And I think there's some positive movement towards that strategic planning and making sure you've got a plan for the longer term. And I think somebody mentioned on the chat about dealing with tunneling spoils and figuring out different ways to manage material as it comes to the surface. I think there's progress being made, but I think there's opportunity still for improvement.
Okay, that poll will be back up at 3:45. So if you haven't answered it, we'll get into that again. I'm going to go to the next question here. Is there a technology gap among contractors, or is everyone generally using the same technology and engineering systems? And maybe Warren, you can start with that one.
Sure. In terms of technology, I think a lot of the technology used for sampling and reporting and moving that documentation through the system really hasn't changed a lot. I think the biggest disconnect we're seeing is what is considered a reasonable level of effort in terms of how many samples do you collect and where do you collect them and what level of reporting do you complete and what level of sign off do you have from a QP. I think that's the big disconnect, and I think it's slowly closing, but there are still firms out there that are, a contractor asks you to grab 3 samples from a defined pile and document that as a soils report, which is how it's been done since '89. That's a long way from meeting the intent of the new regulation in Ontario. And I think there's other firms that are right to the nth degree fully addressing the regulation. And I think that gap is slowly closing, but I think there's still a ways to go there. And then we see a disconnect on some of the sampling approaches. Do you do leachate sampling? How do you build that in? And that piece is still, I think, a struggle as well.
So over to Kevin and Emma, perhaps on the technology piece, because we've got, obviously different platforms that are coming to fore, and then how do those tie together with sampling, for example? Are lab results part of your platform, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's always the contractor and the owner from our perspective, and the way they work together varies from project to project, and it usually is dependent on tender language and those requirements of the contractor. The contractor looks to the owners and they look to the project leaders as to their requirements. If they see that they're not requiring anything from them, whether or not that's the sampling, having their own QP on board, or having the tracking, then they're simply not going to do that. I would flip the question around a little bit and say, is there a disconnect among owners in terms of what their reporting and engineering systems are, and also between their own entities as well? I talk to developers in different regions who have different reporting systems from their municipalities among their different divisions. And to me, that's the biggest concern, because again, how can we do anything with our soil? How can we optimize it, reuse it between sites if our own entities aren't even communicating within each other?
I can add on to that as well. I completely agree with what Kevin said, but it's also a matter of the skill level with digital tools. We see a lot of that. There's some people who are really comfortable using a digital tool to, for example, track their soil or find a site on a solution like DirtMarket, but then you have some people who have been doing it the same way for decades and don't want to move to a digital solution. So you have some people functioning on pen and paper, and you have some people functioning in a digital world. And that's a really big disconnect I think we see a lot of.
Well, don't worry, those people who operate on pen and paper are going to be retiring soon, so we can just focus on the digital. No, I think that's really important as we go towards best practices and implementing them, is coming to some sort of common platforms and software usage. So really pleased to hear DirtMarket and SoilFlow are getting there. Let's move on to another question, and this is kind of related to the technology piece. How are new technologies or programs enhancing soil reuse or disposal? It's similar to what we were just talking about. Maybe it's probably more how you're connecting the host site to where the soil is being taken from. So over to maybe you, Emma, or.
Yeah, for sure. I think technology, one of the big value adds is the speed at which people are able to share information, but then also the storage capabilities. I know Kevin can speak to this too. really important to keep good records, but also be storing those records. So with a digital solution, you can store something indefinitely on your laptop or in a cloud, which is a lot safer than having a paper document. So I think that's one of the big value adds. I'm a little biased. I think DirtMarket is a great digital solution in regard to finding sites, which we've heard a lot of today. Finding reuse sites is very difficult to do. If you have a digital solution, you're able to browse what's near to you. We're able to automatically connect you to who's meeting your standards. It makes it a lot easier. So there's a lot of time saving there as well. So just to summarize that, I think the speed and storage capabilities are essentially unmatched when it comes to what the industry needs for excess soil movement and disposal right now.
Kevin?
Yeah, from my perspective, when it comes to reuse of soils and kind of looking at the overarching problem and the driver of this regulation, which is basically shady business and illegal dumping, it really comes down to a level of transparency. So we can make a deal between one person and another, and a QP signs off and says, yes, that soil report that I have in my hand, signed by that QP, that's good. But how do I know what's coming to my site is in fact what's on this piece of paper? So for us, our customers become a lot more comfortable importing soil from multiple sources when they know that the provenance of that soil coming to them is in fact what the QP is signing off on. Now, we're just a technology, a tool to be used by others, but what we need to have is the QP auditing our technology on a whatever basis that is, and that's actually in the regulation. And the result is, and something we found interesting, is that within our network, our customers want to work with each other because they know that they're implementing this best management practice already ahead of regulation. So they assume they're implementing other best management practices across their other jobs and intend on doing what's best to the best of their ability.
Okay, I mean, I think you hooked on something there that I'm curious about, and maybe others on this call and conference are as well, is QP Aloza. Like we're seeing a lot of QPs on the receiver side and the consultant side, on the owner side. How many QPs are there in Ontario, and how do you become one?
Maybe Krista, that's a good one, or Warren.
Well, so I can't tell you the number. That'd be a great question for Grant, since he's so ingrained in QPCO and they've got a good running list of at least ones that have signed up, although that would not represent everyone in Ontario for sure. In terms of how you become one, though, it's actually well defined in the regulation. To be a qualified person, you need to be a PN or a PGO. And I would say, I don't think it distinctly says this in the regulation, but you would also need to have knowledge of this field. So there could be an engineer in mechanical engineering that would have no business functioning as a QP. So there is also that inherent need for expertise and experience and practicing in this field as well that goes with that.
And I think that kind of speaks to our panel discussion is best practices. Those best practices should come from the QPs involved in the movement of soils. Okay, good. Good. Any other comments on the QP Aloza? I'm curious about the auditing. Maybe we'll find out more from Grant and the QP Co folks. Maybe that's a separate session for a future conference. We do have a question from one of the audience. How does or doesn't the excess soil regulation encourage soil remediation as a more sustainable way?
I'll start on that one, Todd. I would say it encourages in that what the excess soil regulation does first is it does set very clear goals and reuse rules. And so if you can remediate to meet those requirements, then your soil is reusable and should be accepted by other sites. And I think before that, there's too much stigma around contaminated soil and contaminated sites. It'd be very hard to get buy-in to shipping soils from those sites. So it probably just helps open the door a little bit, for we do have very clear structure now around targets you'd have to hit and how that soil would be moved and how it would be tracked. To Kevin's point, that brings a level of transparency that we probably didn't previously have. And so that should help to spur and encourage that kind of activity, hopefully.
I also think as we get further into the implementation of the regulation and closer to the landfill prohibition piece, I think we'll see a stronger push towards, on-site remediation, managing your soil in different ways, and trying to ease that burden on landfill.
I think the other thing we might see, and again, up until now, the focus has very much just been on people getting their arms around the reg and understanding what it is, what it means, how to be compliant to it. And as we're getting a little further down the road, and probably more importantly for those larger soil movement projects, I think we will see more looking to developing site-specific risk-based standards. So I know someone talked earlier about the BRAT tool, and it's been, I would say, probably minimally accessed up until now. But I think for large sites like the Portlands, like I know that was their whole motive, is let's come up with some site-specific standards that help us to facilitate more reuse on site. It will help save our costs. I think as people get more comfortable with the regulation, we'll start seeing people looking more for those places in the regulation where there's flexibility and really looking to figure out how to use that to facilitate better soil reuse and decrease project costs. And that's the place too, where if you're looking at remediation, there'd probably be more opportunity for using remediated soils.
Yeah, that kind of, I think Bruce in an earlier session said he thinks it's crazy removing soil around the country when it could be treated on site. And obviously that's a more sustainable way of managing soil if we don't have to move it hundreds of kilometers. And in fact, I think Megan said this morning that all the fill for Portlands has come from us to those two sites within 7 kilometers. So there's less GHGs going up as a result of truck traffic, and that's good. So that's one sort of benefit of the sustainability side. All right, we do have another question, and please clarify the non-settlement exemption. How is that defined? And I honestly don't know what the non-settlement exemption is all about, so I'll flip it over to you.
So I'll take a quick stab at this, and then Warren can weigh in, because it's been a while since I've looked at that exemption, because it doesn't tend to apply when you're working in the GTA. But my memory of it is a settlement is defined, and I think it's under the Municipal Act. So there's clear sort of boundaries on what a settlement is. And if you're moving less than 2,000 cubic meters, I want to say, from an area that is outside a settlement area, the general understanding is probably that's pretty clean soil. And so that does get you access to some exemptions to the planning requirements under the regulation. Although I do always like to reiterate, the regulation always applies. You are never exempt from the regulation. You are just exempt to some of the requirements under the regulation.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. And I guess the only thing I'd caution people on, it may give you some flexibility, but if the receiving site has set requirements, you still need to meet their requirements. So each of those exemptions, you need to really think through, does it apply to the entire project or just a small piece of it?
And that brings us back to the getting closure on your receiving site. So the better you have a sense of what your receiving sites are and what the requirements are, the better your project planning as a whole, for sure.
Okay. We're going back to QPs now, because there's another question about, and this speaks to best practices, as I mentioned. Where can a contractor hire a QP? Is there a list of QPs provided by the Ministry of Environment that can approve the soil management report? And before I put that out to the panel, we did hear from Grant on the question of how many QPs there are. And QPCO is just starting out and has 100 PGOs and risk assessors, but there are many more. And I guess that's just a matter of quantifying them, getting them registered. But there is not an accounting anywhere of this. But maybe over to you in the panel if that information is different, if there are a list of QPs on the ministry site.
I don't believe there are, and I don't believe the ministry will ever vet QPs. They will never say, use this QP over another QP. They're very careful about not being involved in that kind of endorsement. So your best source of information, honestly, is QPCO, because it would at least have, here's who's in our community. So you at least know that's they're in the list. They are part of a community that is trying to be current and up to the best practices in the regulation. So that's a great source. If you have no sense of who QPs are, that's a great, first step of going to look for that kind of information.
So Kevin and Emma, over to you on, is there sort of some connection on your platforms to QPs, a QP directory of sorts, or maybe there's QPs that are involved in more transactions than others? Speaks to kind of that transparency issue, but I'm wondering if there's a QP connection with each of your platforms.
There's nothing within our platform. There are definitely QPs that consistently come back to using soil flow and bringing it as a tool for their different customers. So no, nothing on ours, but yeah.
Yeah, similar to Kevin, it's not formally integrated into our platform yet. However, we do have people reach out to us and ask for QP. recommendations. And I think that's just part of the regulation and how there's a gap between how much people know about what they need to do. So oftentimes they might have found a site via DirtMarket and they're ready to move soil and they go, oh, but I need a QP and I need a haulage company and I need everything in between. So we're more than happy to connect people as needed. It's not formally built into the platform at this time though.
Okay. Okay, we'll jump into another question here. And this is kind of maybe a little bit of a sneak question on our part. It's about further education on how to best reuse or dispose of excess soils. What's the best way to spread the word? I mean, we're all preaching to the converted for the large part. There's 280 people here who are obviously vested interest in soils and site remediation, but how do you tell the broader audience across Canada that excess soils is an environmental issue and they should be treated properly?
I'd love to see that the ministry being able to release publicly a lot of the guidance that they've been working really hard on. And, you know, some of the things have come out over the last couple of weeks with their outreach sessions, but it would be great to see that the Q&As posted and really get that broadly messaged out to the contracting and construction industry and to find like a key spot to put all that information. Right now, it's really hard to find.
And I would, oh, go ahead, Kevin. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Krista. I think there's always a need for more education, but ultimately there has to be a willingness to learn. And I think that those who have had that willingness to learn have already learned, because this has been going on for a very, very long time. So for us, you know, that willingness to learn will only really come from alleviating a pain point or providing value to a certain extent. So there is so much good in this regulation. And when people talk about, oh, all of these extra costs and it's such a pain and so on, there's really nothing more expensive than having to find a fill site at the last minute, having to do rush samples because you don't have enough, having to do all in project delays as well, which will inevitably happen. So what the entire regulation does is it forces upfront planning, which is ultimately going to have tremendous benefit overall to that project leader. So communicating that to the owners, I think, is key. And then I think we'll have this trickle down approach.
And I would just add to that there are, I'd say, clear segments that have been a little slower to get engaged in learning the regulation. So someone asked a question earlier about farmers. I don't think the farming community has been part of this. I do believe there is supposed to be outreach or has been outreach through OMAFRA to that community. So there's probably some very targeted outreach that could happen. The other community the communities that seem a little bit later to the table are some of the development communities, certainly not all. Some developers have been super proactive in this regulation and at the table as it's evolved. And others are definitely kind of coming a little bit late to the table and figuring it out now. And then there's the contracting community, and same thing. There's contractors that have been part of this regulation that are very sophisticated and are already, you know, well on their way of making sure it's applied properly, and others that are just starting to come to the table now. So if there's specific associations that can do outreach, I know I think it's RACCAO has been engaged there. I know they've been doing that outreach, but to Kevin's point, maybe there's a bit of willful ignorance. I mean, at some point you have to invest in actually understanding it and making sure it's applied.
Yeah, I'll just quickly jump in here too. I think Kevin's point about putting it into context about what it really means is really important. We see not a ton of value add when we say, oh, let us tell you about the regulations. But when we say reusing soil can save you like 13-14% on a project's total cost, that's when sort of the lights go on and it's, oh, tell me more about the regulation. Tell me more about what I need to do to pre-plan and be involved. So certainly putting it in terms that make sense for the designated audience is really, really important. So we do a lot of that with educational content and marketing to make it a bit more palatable than a huge regulation. What does it really mean on the ground to the people we're talking to is a really big part of the education piece, I think.
Yeah, so you mentioned, Krista, RCCAO. Yeah, they have done some reports on excess soil, so that is the good organization to advance advocacy and education, the farmers through OMAFRA and others. I think obviously Environment Journal on our platform, we're going to start educating more people about excess soils through events like this, but even more so to people to understand maybe case studies. Did you know that, you know, Portlands was built from the excess soil that came from the Globe and Mail and on its ed site? So maybe some sort of case studies around that maybe would incorporate some of the platforms like Soil Flow and DirtMarket would be a fun thing for us to do. Do have Another question about best practices being used to address the disconnects in the tracking system and to reduce the environmental cost of reusing, disposing excess construction soils. I think we've touched on that a little bit, but I want to go back to the tracking systems to make sure that we're getting efficiency here with the management of excess soils. I think that's
Sure.
for Kevin.
Yeah, can you just reiterate what the actual question there is, Todd?
Best practices being utilized to address disconnects in the tracking system to reduce environmental cost of reusing, disposing soils.
Yeah, for sure. So it comes down to data standardization. So we're seeing two approaches specifically from municipalities, I would say, or from owners, I should say. And that is, the first step for a municipality is to say, you need to digitally track your soil on all of our projects. This is the information you need to collect. Deliver it to me in any way that you want to deliver it. And what happens there is you end up with many different report styles. Some are missing that information. Some you don't know how they collected that information. And you end up going through and vetting and combing it and putting it into your own data system, doing, transposing that information. You end up with data entry error. Then we have our, owners that say, okay, we're going to standardize our data collection so we could see what we're actually doing, develop that baseline, like we said before, and use that data to consistently improve on other parts of our business. Soil reuse, testing, cost per cube, overall transportation costs, time of year and how many loads we move for that, and then holding it on a single system. And doing that data standardization, one, the contractor is happy that they know it's a level playing field in the way everyone's using it, and everybody can begin to take advantage of all of that data ahead of them. So we've seen both ultimately work. Some is a best practice, others going to lead to that disconnect between contractors.
Okay, the poll is back up. So maybe everybody take a chance to answer that poll and we'll get the results before we wrap up the session. But before we do, Emma made a good point in our chat. I don't know if it's up there, if we could post the Ontario is wasting a precious resource. Is that a report, Emma? Where did that come from?
Yeah, it's a report. People can find it online. I just think it has some really great statistics about the value of reusing soil. It's available online. I'm not sure if we can drop it in the general chat for people to read.
Yeah, we'll do that. Do you know the source? Do you remember where it came from?
It was the I'd have to look again at the author page.
Okay, while we're finding it, I do have a soils joke. So, did you hear about the thief who stole my soil? I'm going after him, but I'm losing ground. So, okay, back to our poll, back to questions. We'll get that report posted, and I think we'll also the report from RCCAO, and I think QP Co. obviously will want to get some information from them on the list of QPs. I think what we want to do now is maybe talk a little about this excess soils registry system. So at the beginning of our call, I asked Emma, are we tracking this? I'm not only tracking it, but are we doing soil matching like they do in the UK? And so maybe we can talk a little bit about the registry and how that works and how the four of you are managing that.
So the registry is brand new. I know it was up and functional. I want to say it was Wednesday of last week, I think. And our PRA or our PRRA, whatever their acronym is, has been doing a great job of webinars to train people on the registry. But I'd say there's still a lot for us to learn and understand about the registry. I was thinking about that as you were talking about QPs and as their list of QPs, and I was trying to remember if the QP is something that is publicly viewable in the registry. So when a QP has been part of a project we see, and I honestly just can't remember. So if somebody on here does know that, that would be good to drop into the chat too. But I do think that could ultimately be a means of identifying reuse sites as well. You will see sites getting posted on that as well. So I think that could ultimately help to serve as somewhat of a means of matching different sites. And I do think we'll start to see people using that as people get more comfortable and familiar with that registry, because it is very new to the industry right now.
Yeah, I'm waiting for someone to do the first registration. I kind of open it up every day to see, okay, who's going to go ahead and do this. So I don't know if there's anyone on the call who wants to hit that button now, but very interested to see what an actual registration looks like, because I'm looking at the dashboard now and it says no results. So January 1st, you're going to have to do it anyways. So someone's got to step up.
So what's the barrier? Why is nobody stepping up to register their soils?
It's not required yet, Todd.
Don't have
It's
to.
not required
go.
until January 1st.
So
So
there's going to be a flood of thousands of site registrations on January 1st or 2nd or 3rd?
it's possible. Some of them might still fall into the grandfathering clause for a little bit, but I think we will see that in January.
I think there'll be a little bit of dancing and trying to see if you can find a way to show that you don't need to do it quite yet. But I think there's going to be a bunch that go up early in January.
So does that include the farmer who's got a little sign saying clean fill wanted? Does that person have to register?
So I think
Depends on
for
how much.
yeah, I was gonna say for I think it's 10,000 cubic
Right.
meters, is it not, Warren? If
Okay.
you're more than that, then you have to register. Less than that, you wouldn't as a reuse site. So it's more directed to source sites registering, but some reuse sites will have to register.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think that most of the reuse sites that I deal with are well over 10,000 cubic meters, and they're long-term reuse sites. So those are going to have to register no matter what. So, we'll see if those end up going up January 1st, or what it will do is they will become public to, all that need reuse sites as well. So in a way, it's doing it itself.
Okay, we're almost winding down here. The results of the polls are in, and I think it echoes some of the comments we've had in this session already that better advanced strategic planning, 32% said that's a key, with software programs that aid with soil tracking, following and behind all of the above being the most popular answer. So I'll let each of you kind of do a closing minute on, what is it going to take to implement excess soils management standards? Where do you think we'll be in a year from now?
Okay, I guess I can go first since I started this session. Planning, I'm going to just keep beating the planning drum. Like, do your cut fill analysis early, get some information on soil quality early, think about reuse sites early. And then what I think what we will see in the next year, as I've said, is looking beyond just the basics of the reg and looking for those nuances and variances where people can take advantage of flexibility in the regulation to deliver their projects in a way that's more schedule effective, more cost effective. I think we'll start seeing that shifting focus from the basic requirements of you need to do this, this, and this before you move soil to how do we actually take advantage of some of the flexibility and really do this in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think that the planning is probably the key piece. The other one for me is for that group of contractors and consultants that are not yet really building excess soil management into their projects. Now's the time. You don't want to get stopped on January 15th, trucks going down the highway and told that you just can't do it anymore. Now's the time to get things in line, figure out if there's gaps, figure out if you are exempt or not, and make sure you're ready for January 1st.
Yeah, I think I'll reiterate the pre-planning is a huge part of the regulation, but I also want to say that there's lots of people working really hard to make this regulation a little bit easier for people. So to explore digital options, to ask around, to open those conversations first. It may not be as daunting as you think it is once you open those conversations and tap into some of the really good resources there are in the industry. So I would say welcome it with open arms. If you push back against it, I'm sure it'll just seem a lot harder than maybe it actually is. So I'm hoping people are able to utilize the resources that already exist and they don't need to reinvent the wheel to adhere to the regulation for the most part.
All right, Kevin, bring us home.
Yeah, I think it's all just about take a chance on the regulation. It's forcing compliance for you, but try and find the good in it. That pre-planning that everyone's talking about, watch and see the effect that taking those borehole samples ahead of going into any excavation has. See how knowing what's in your project is going to prevent those delays. Find those reuse sites before you actually start your project or even bid out your contracts. And, watch and see what happens to your pro formas and to all your costs that you have.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Warren, Krista, Emma, and Kevin for a very good panel. I think we covered a lot of ground. There was lots of good questions. That 2016 report was called Wasting a Precious Resource. It was published by RCCAO, OSPI, and the Greater Toronto Sewer Water Main Contractors Association, all sponsors of today's event. So we'll have that posted up there for everybody as well. And now I'm going to turn things over to Corinne to wrap up today. And thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you, Todd. And thank you to all of our speakers today and my colleagues, Connie Vitello and Natasha Mauji, who have been working tirelessly behind the scenes to make sure this event went off without a hitch. So kudos to them. And thank you, of course, to our sponsors, Soil Flow, Ontario Society of Professional Engineers, RCCAO, Stantec, the Cannington Group, TraceNet, Wilms and Shire, WSP, Aris, Ontario Sewer and Water Main Construction, Association, and Parcel. Your participation through the Whova app, chat features, poll questions really drive a level of intimacy and community that would not otherwise be possible on a virtual platform such as this. So if you missed one of today's sessions and would like an opportunity to watch the recording, all sessions will be available online in the Whova app by tomorrow. The platform and everything it has to offer will continue to be available for 30 more days. Now, for the fun part, I get to announce the winners of our photo contest and leaderboard. Drum roll, please. If Todd was here, he'd be drumming away. First up, the winner of our photo contest is Jose Hay. So congratulations, Jose. And the winner of our leaderboard is Kyle Vandermeer. So super big congratulations to both winners. Once again, from all of us here at Actual Media, thank you for joining us. Enjoy a wonderful, safe, and happy holiday break. We look forward to seeing you all again in 2022 for the 6th annual Excess Soil Symposium. Stay safe and happy holidays.